Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob Steele, the events manager for Banyan Books and Sound. Today we are delighted to be hosting Helen Knott in conversation with Angela Sterritt on Helen's new book, Becoming a Matriarch, a memoir. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that although we have participants joining us from around the world, the physical location of Banyan Books is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Donations to Banyan Books help support these programs to be free for all. Just click on the PayPal link in the YouTube show notes below to donate. For those in our live audience, Helen and Angela welcome your questions. Please type questions into the chat box at any point during the event. And now for introductions. Helen Knott is a Dane Zaa, Nehiyaw, Métis, and mixed Euro descent woman from Prophet River First Nations. She lives in Fort St. John, British Columbia. In 2016, Helen was one of 16 global changemakers featured by the Nobel Women's Initiative for being committed to ending gender-based violence. Helen was selected as a 2019 RBC Taylor Prize emerging author. Her debut memoir, In My Own Moccasins, was a national bestseller, longlisted for the RBC Taylor Prize, and it won the Saskatchewan Book Award for Indigenous Peoples Publishing. And of course, today we're going to be speaking about her new book, Becoming a Matriarch. Angela Sterritt is an award-winning journalist, writer, and artist. She's the author of Unbroken, My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls. Angela worked as a CBC journalist for close to 20 years as a host and television, radio, and digital reporter. She's a proud member of the Gitxsan Nation. Banyan recently hosted Angela for a virtual event on her book Unbroken, and you can watch that on Banyan's YouTube channel. I can honestly say it was one of my favorite of the events that we've had, so be sure to check that out later. Today our guest will be speaking about Helen's new book, Becoming a Matriarch, a memoir. The book is available from Banyan, and you can learn more about Helen's work at reclaimthewarrior.com and about Angela's work at angelasterritt.com. So it's a great honor to have them both here with us today. Please welcome Helen Knott and Angela Sterritt. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So you just released this best-selling book. It's so beautiful. I was just telling you, it's soothing to the soul. It's medicine for the mind. It's so poetic. It's so beautiful. It's such a rich story of land, love, grief, pain, and beauty. And I'm just wondering, you just released this book. What's it been? What's the feedback been like so far to Becoming a Matriarch?
Yeah, I think so far, because I was able to go to different cities on my book tour and meet with people. And funny enough, I didn't expect to meet so many people who had been through recent losses or grief. And I found that I was holding space or connecting with people who had experienced losses in their life, like recently, or like in Toronto, someone was like, my mom had just passed away like a month ago, or this is the anniversary of the loss of this person in my life. And just having a lot of like real moments with individuals. And I'm always grateful for those moments of connection with people. So for me, that makes all of the time spent in rooms by yourself writing things worth it, for sure.
Yeah. One of the things I was struck by in your book is how you talk about the land, and it's very much, parallel in many ways to my book. It's a story of a lot of pain as well. But I think for me, a landing place is always the land, right? A place that kind of holds us in our healing and in our connection, right? And belonging, something that, all humans long for. And you talk about, and I want to talk about, when you talk about at the beginning of your book about the idea of living maps. You talk about stories that thicken blood, being bound to places that love you back. And you say, if the mountains and the water don't know my name, do I have a name at all? You talk about the wind carrying home for you. And I'm just wondering, how has land guided your writing process and sort of helped you weave this beautiful living map called Becoming a Matriarch?
I think, like, first off, without land and without connection to land and water, there would be no writing, because I don't think I would be well enough to write anything, because it's such a crucial part of just like keeping me sane and keeping me well enough to be able to exist in this like ecosystem web of like relationships. And that relationship is so vital in regards to wellness. And I think that's how I can remember this moment. And I was out in the valley and watching a sunset with my brother. And it was just like, wow, I know how to exist and how to be in the world and be okay because of like the water that's here. Because I know I can take myself there, because I know I can do these things to take care of myself. Because even just like watching a sunset or a sunrise, more of a sunset person, I sleep in. A sunset, watching a sunset will like help me stay well. And I can get medicine in that way. And if I was removed from this like intricate relationship, then I don't know who I am either, because it's such a big part of me. Like the land spaces that we come from and that shape us also shape the stories that come out of us. And I think about that in terms of like when I'm meeting different people and the geography that help form them, I guess. And I'm always curious about how that shapes like worldview and ceremony and all of these different things.
And I want to talk about the idea of becoming a matriarch, right? And I think for my people, it is very much bound up in the land as well. Our sovereignty is not, power over the land. It's power with the land. It's what binds us to the spirit of the land. And so I wanted to talk about this concept of matriarchy. And it's different, right? We're not homogenous people. There's 600 or so distinct First Nations across this land, as well as Inuit and Métis people. For my people, we have matriarchy encoded in our law. We have our hereditary chiefs and we have our matriarchs. And it's a formality in our culture. We're a matrilineal society. So even when I wanted to be accepted by my house group, legally recognized by my house group, Wigak, my grandfather's house group, the House of the Big Wings, I needed to be adopted in because my mother's white. And that happened June 21st. So I think some people might not understand how formal these concepts are to us, but also how varied they are from nation to nation.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about the concept of, I think it was local matriarchy or something like that.
Matrilocal.
Matrilocal.
Yeah, and I think that's important to differentiate that, because there are so many differences within Indigenous communities and how matriarchy is present, or how lineage is even like traced, right? And it changes as you go across to different tribes. And then with us, knowing that for the majority of the time, we were matrilocal, which just means that if people were to get together, they would live in the maternal village. So if they were to, like, the man would move to the woman's village, or it's not even a village because we were nomadic. And with that, then women were the placeholders, or the sites of like knowledge, where they would be the holders of knowledge of the landscape, of the history of that space, kind of like being able to tell the lay of the land. And yeah, because it wasn't so much in your face. And I remember speaking with someone more recently about one of our communities here, and she was like, I just wish the women were like in spaces of leadership more often. But I come from a place too, in my specific community, where we've had like a female chief for probably, but this is an elected chief, but probably for like 40, 50 years. Like there was maybe like one gap of like 3 or 4 years, one term where it was a male. And but someone was saying like, I just wish that there was like more Dane Zaa women in like spaces of leadership. And I'm like, oh, but you don't see what's going on like in the homes. You don't see what's going on when decisions are made, and when things are kind of mapped out, and knowing the amount of influence that Indigenous women or Dane Zaa women have in those spaces, that isn't like in your face, like Western based forms of leadership.
The other thing, riffing off the idea of women, one of the things that you were talking about was you were saying women will throw down for love. And I think there's a part in your book where the chief comes, and I think it was it your mom who punched him out, saying this is
my grandma.
Your grandma, right? And it's this notion of how the Indian Act kind of attempted to disrupt love. And I think that's a common theme throughout your book, is this resistance to the Indian Act, this resistance to entities that attempt to take our land away, take our love away. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about that, because I think a lot of people don't understand how, I guess, the Indian Act attempted to disrupt the matriarchy in our societies, in particular when it came to women.
Yeah, I think for me, like, women and land have always went together, and women have always had that like final say. So I know here, in terms of like that disruption, or not disruption, yeah, kind of a disruption, but also like a removal from land, or a disruption in that relationship, happened more so, I would say, in my grandma's generation, because we weren't necessarily settled until World War II happened, and they were building the Alaska Highway. So the highway up to Alaska, and that was the US Army. And our community actually ended up settling into the old Army barracks. And so that became the old reserve. And that was the first time it was like more in a space that was located in like not nomadic, not seasonally based. That's when school started happening, and children were being like either shipped off or going to Indian day school. And then from there, just all of the changes that happened very rapidly in terms of the allocation of land, and that like, okay, well, you can't go here, you can't turn here. And then in the 90s, in this territory coming toward oil and gas, like the oil and gas boom in this territory. And so then all of a sudden, so much of your territory is taken up. Like, I think it's the Blueberry River First Nations territory where they did a study with the David Suzuki Foundation that was like 80% was impacted by either like lease roads or well sites or some type of development within their territory. And looking at how that access and relationship has shifted over time due to colonialism, and how that also interrupts like that transmission of knowledge that takes place there. So I think of like berry bushes and how berry bushes are just like a site of storytelling, knowledge, like history, our oral history, being transmitted down, because I learned so much, like taking my grandma berry picking and just talking with her and spending the day. And my son, when he was little, like we would all go together. So there would be all three of us, so the three generations, like picking berries. And, you know, eventually that place, now there's like a pipeline behind it. And so we don't go there anymore. And it being harder and harder to find these spaces to kind of do what, you know, we set out to do. And I remember one year my grandma was like, you know, are these berries even safe to eat? Because we had went somewhere else and I was like, I don't know. Like, I can't tell you, yes, that they are safe to eat, because they might not be. Like, we might be like picking berries that have been contaminated in our territory. And I think of that ongoing disruption of just like being, right? And being able to be in relationship with our matriarchs and land all together at once, out in these spaces. And so for me, whenever it came to something like land-based, and if I was doing work around the Peace River and saying no to Site C, all I ever needed was like that go ahead from my mom and my aunties and my grandma to be like, yeah, that's the right thing. Like, no, they can't remove you. Yes, this is your territory. That's it. And I was like, okay, you know, I'll go stand on a front line and exercise my treaty rights and do whatever is need to be done. Because my grandma and my mom said, like, that gave that nod of like, yeah.
I think one of the most profound aspects of your book is loss. And we were just talking about that today, that we both have lost our moms to cancer. And kind of like tying that back into the land too. Like, you know, I don't know how my mom passed away, but I know she worked for a mine for many, many years before she passed on. And so she was always like so curious about if that's how she ended up getting cancer. But the loss of losing a mom is so profound. No one really understands how massively life-changing that is unless you've had that happen to you, and then in such a hard way too. And you talk about also losing your Asu, your grandmother. And, you know, as I was reading the book, or as I was reading and listening to it, I just kept on thinking of how much wisdom you had, and how you carry that with such strength and why, like a wise sage. And how did you get there? Because as I was listening and reading, I was just like, it's just so hard. Like, you carry, you know, I remember when my mom passed on, it was sort of like, oh, it'll take 2 years. And then, you know, now that it's been like 20 years, I'm like, no, it's a pain that never goes away. It's a loss. It's an emptiness, or a space, as you say. It's the space that is there that never leaves you. And I think for me, it's been like the way that I sort of address that emptiness or loss is through spirit and through spirituality. And I'm a deeply spiritual person. When people aren't spiritual, it's hard for me to relate to them, because it's a massive part of my grieving process, and then also my connection, right, to family. And I'm wondering what's been your like trajectory to wisdom in that sense? Like how have you held that space for yourself?
Yeah. I think, when I was writing this book, and when you're writing memoir, it's like repeated exposure to emotions and to hard feelings. And I remember sometimes I'd sit down and it would be like 5 minutes and I would be bawling. And I'm like, okay, I had to close the laptop and walk away. But coming back, and when you sit with something, you're able to like smooth it out and to navigate through it. And I feel like writing this allowed me to come to a new place of understanding in terms of what that loss meant, and what losing both my mom and my grandma, Maya Sue, looked like, felt like, and how it transformed me, and even how I carried them in the world after that. So every time I sat down to write this book, I would do like a little, okay, girls, like, you got to come in and you got to help me write this book because you better show up. And they helped me write this book. So they were like here with me, and I would like have these conversations with them at the beginning. And then I think maybe about 3/4 of the way through, I stopped doing that. And I was like, okay, I'm writing this last portion of the book on my own. Like, I'm going to show up into the space and not call them in there. And there was something that I didn't include in the book because I was like, I just want this part to be mine. And it's like a larger story, but essentially like being in a space of like ceremony. And I felt my mom like kiss my forehead. And that kiss was kind of like I'm not going to be around as much. Like, you got this. You can do this, but I'm going to step back. And I was like crying. I was like, okay. And so like learning to navigate my life on my own, even though she wasn't there, but I'd be like, Mom, Grandma, like call them into space whenever I was feeling freaked out or whatever that looked like. And learning to be like, okay, you have to learn how to be in the world on your own and make these decisions on your own and not call them into everything. And still doing it sometimes. And like you said, that's like an emptiness that doesn't go away, that it still comes up. And when it comes up, I will just allow it to take up space. And I don't run from it either, because I'm like, we polarize our emotions and we think something's like good or bad. And the harder things to move through, like grief, sadness, that type of stuff, like it's not fun. But I also think about us being here as humans to experience like the range of human emotions, and what a gift that is to love so greatly, even when the loss is so hard too, but to know both ends of that.
I'm thinking when you were talking about how hard it was to write this book, and I'm thinking about my own book as well. Like at times it can be really traumatic, and you kind of have to put the pen down and take some time. It took me 7 years to write my book because of that. And I'm thinking about, in the book, you talk about going to Guatemala and having that experience of healing there. And it just reminded me of, one of the things I talk about a lot. People ask me a lot, like, what are the healing modalities that you have at your disposal to get you through these really hard moments? And so I'm wondering if you can talk about some of that. Like, you just talked a lot about spirit, but what are the ways that you get through some of those harder points where it is really traumatizing or re-traumatizing or triggering, or because how long did it take you to write your book?
This one, I would say like 2.5 years, but like 3 with edits. So I think with that one, I was probably like, my first book took me a lot longer. And that one, my mom helped me so much with that one, because there was a lot of, that one was a heavier trauma when I was writing through that book. And my mom would like put me back together. So she would like hold me while I cried. And then this one, it was like, okay, you're on your own and you're trying to figure out how to make it through these hard spaces and these hard stories. And I think it's just that gentleness of like taking care when you need to. It was really what I had learned in grief was allowing the hard moments to come when they come and letting them pass through, like feeling them to their fullest extent and then letting them go. And then I would just find those like moments throughout the day that brought me joy. And they would be like the simplest things, like sunset and good coffee in my hand, or a song, like something very small. And I would like give myself to the joy of that moment as fully as I could, just as I gave myself to like the grief. And so I would hit these moments of like just like happiness and joy and wonder. And then I would also hit moments in the day of like really hard stuff and falling apart, or cutting a pepper and then like I'm on the floor, like something ridiculous like that. And but like I'm like, it's not linear, right? And even my days have been like this range, and I could experience all of that and still say like I have a pretty good day. Like I had all of these good moments, and I feel like it's given me this ability to just approach the world with this like wonder now of being like, wow, this is amazing. Look at this. And so I'm grateful for that, because that's something that taught me. But for other things, like I think it's really important to cry with sound. And if you're really struggling, I always encourage people, I'm like, cry from that deep place in your belly, like with sound, and you pull it, like you pull that out of you where it's actual like work. And I feel like when you do that, there's so much clearing that takes place, because a lot of times we'll fight it and we'll like push it back down, right? Tap it down. But when you like let yourself just ugly cry as loud as you need to, that's body work. I feel like that's kind of like a remnant or an echo of what I had learned in Guatemala with David E. in terms of like letting your body tell that story through sound. And then obviously like medicines, going to the water is a huge one. And someone had asked me, they were like, you didn't talk a lot about sightsee in this book. And I was like, yeah, because there was only so much space for grief that I could hold. And that element of like the Peace River, they have the sightsee which is like a mega hydro dam, and they're supposed to start flooding soon, and it's going to be flooding like 82 kilometers of the valley. And that has been like one of my greatest love stories has been with the river. And I was like, I just couldn't go there. It was too much for me to add into this space too, because that's still ongoing, and there's still like grief that's active with the land as well.
And you mentioned David E. I was thinking a lot about that when you were talking about your experience in Guatemala, because he was a white guy, right? Who was doing this healing practice. And I think about this a lot, because I think more people are seeing benefits of things like meditation and connecting to land and connecting to spirit and higher path and all of this stuff. And, I hear a lot of people say, oh, that's woo-woo, or that's so white or whatever. But when I look at these practices, for me, I don't know if it's right to say they've been co-opted from Indigenous people, but they've been co-opted from cultures. And I'm wondering like how you navigated that in that Guatemala experience in particular. And like how brave of you to be vulnerable, like with a white man healer. Like, I don't think I could have done that, to be honest. But it sounded super powerful when I was listening. And there is a similar situation that I go to here in Vancouver. But I have to navigate that a lot. Like there's a guy who does these sound baths in Vancouver, and he's a white guy, and he's drumming, and he's doing something that sounds kind of like throat singing. And so I'm trying to do these sound baths, but then I'm just like, wait a second, what are you doing? Like, is this appropriate? And you don't want to like end your experience and be like, but like, I don't know. And I don't know. I think when I'm in those spaces, part of me is like fully immersed in the experience, getting what I need out of it. But the other half is like torn, so I'm wondering how you navigate that, because you want to accept the beauty of someone who's done these practices for many, many, many years, and they're good at it, or it's been gifted to them from spirit or wherever, or maybe from an Indigenous culture. But at the same time, it feels ick, there's an ick factor about it.
Yeah, I don't know. And that's on me for not looking up where that specific practice called amine. I will always almost say anime, and I have to like visualize it. I'm like, don't say anime because it's amine. Has originated from, but like breath work and body work. And I feel like because it was David E., there was an element of healing there, cultivating a safe space where he walked me through that, and even like had that moment of like, I'm here only as a helper. Like, I'm just here to help you. I will not harm you. I will hold a space with love and care. And I just like started bawling and think about that part of me too that was healed in that space of like this big, very big, because he was like 6'4", like white male, who's very loud and like big energy, holding this healing space for me with such love and care. And what that did, like, for me and my sense of like safety historically, like it healed so much in that moment. And that's even before we started the process. But I think in terms of other ceremonies and other things, I find myself being careful depending on what and where I go through, because as we've said, like there's so much in terms of relationship. And, that comes down to even like, if I go into a sweat lodge, because I'm also Cree, I think about, there's a relationship with the rocks, with the willows, with the medicines, all of those things. And if you remove that relationship piece or that respect piece out of there, then it's not what it's meant to be. And so I'm always trying to be cognizant of that fact for all of these elements to be in place. And I think too, I believe, because I've always said, like, when we walk into rooms, we have all of our like ancestors who walk with us. That's everybody, right? We walk around with all of the ones who have gone before us out here in the world. And I wonder sometimes, I think we mentioned this before in one of our previous talks, was just like, our ancestors in the background, like having conversations with each other, like, hey, this person needs this, like, tell them to come over here. Hey, this person needs this. And sometimes like that's how we find each other, is through these like ancestral connections that are happening in spaces without us knowing. And I believe in that as well. But yeah, I think, I'm always weary of seeing things that are in other spaces, because I think about the relationships and respect and knowledge that it takes to hold those things. Because we know, even in our cultures, there's so much work in order to be able to be given knowledge, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like that's something I grapple with too, because in my culture, there's just so much protection around story even, right? It's like there's ownership of story, and there's protection around ceremony and keeping those the way they are, right? And there's, I guess, like for us too, Giksan, like we don't share certain elements of our culture. We call it our cedar box. And that's something that we opened up during the Delgamuch to fight for our rights, because we knew how important it was to get our land back. And so it's interesting. Like I'm just thinking about that, the guy with the sound bath, because a lot of these practices are so sacred, right? And they are so important. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking was when we last had the discussion in Victoria, you were talking about seeing yourself as a grandmother, and you could have that grandmother spirit. And then I'm also thinking about that in terms of becoming a matriarch. And I know you'd written a thing on Facebook about somebody saying, wait, how old are you? Like, you're only 35, like you basically kind of insinuating you can't be a matriarch. And that's something that I really admired about you. Like we met, and I remember like something happened that night, and you kind of you were in my backseat and you put your hand on my shoulder and said, it's okay. And you just have such a grandmother spirit about you, or a motherly, but it seems so innate. Is that something you've always, and I know this is like maybe like super personal, but people probably appreciate this. Is that a way that you've always been, or is this something you've kind of been becoming? I guess it's a lifelong process, but is that something you've been intentionally working on, or is that something people have always sort of recognized in you?
That's interesting. So it was like, has that always been there? And it's just like unearthing or stepping into, which is probably an element of it, but also thinking of like how my mom and my grandma were. Like, my mom loved kids. She was very like warm, gave the best hugs, like made people feel like right at home. She was good in ways with children too that I'm just not. Like, I don't have some of the way that she was, like the heart that she had. And my grandma being like everyone's grandma, so like giving hugs and people calling her grandma, and she was just like loving in the world. And I'm like, I want to be that. Like, I want to be everyone's grandma. And I think, you know, as I've worked through my own stuff and have ventured into those like dark corners of my own journey, then I've been learning how to witness, hold space, and walk into those spaces with other people. And that's given me this, like, almost want to say like rootedness in myself, to be able to just like be more open. And I think for the grandma spirit, grandma energy, that happened more so in this last year. And there was like twice I found myself in different spaces with elders, like two different elders. And they were telling their stories, and they got into a space that was like really heavy, and they were crying, and something just moved in me where I was like, that's okay, my girl. Like, that's okay. Or, don't worry, baby. Like, just breathe, baby. And I was like, whoa, afterwards, I was like, who do I think I am? Just calling like elders like baby and my girl. And I was, but it just happened so automatic. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Like, we probably never grow out of that, like wanting to be called my girl or baby, or feel that like pet on the head, like that, those things that I miss from like my grandma or my mom, or that I yearn for. And I'm like, okay, I'm in my grandma energy now. Like, that's happening. That's something that's happening, and I'm just allowing it. And I think, yeah, when you, there's a quote out there, and people have probably seen it, where it's like, no one knows the level of violence it took to become this gentle. And I feel like that's been my life, essentially. Like, it's been a refining process and a stripping down, and like coming into this space of being not so much malleable, but like soft and open. And I just, like, this year, or this next while, I prayed on a full moon, like I think it was like in the summer, and I was like, okay, I really want to become like a good lover, and not like lover just in a platonic sense, but like lover in the world, lover of people, being able to have loving relationships and show up in this way. And I was like, and I really want to learn that gently, please. Because I'm like, I want no hard lessons, but yeah.
Yeah. I have a healer that I go to, and she's always telling me we can learn without going through complete and utter trauma and hard mistakes and all that. We can learn and grow and evolve through joy. And that's something I haven't really mastered yet. I think we just do, for whatever reason, learn those hard lessons through really hard experiences. And I'm wondering, do you feel you've mastered that? Can you grow and evolve through joy and peace and love? Is that possible? Is that attainable?
I'm trying. I would like to. And I try to catch myself a little bit earlier. Like, sometimes it'll still take a bit. Like, I won't get to that like hardcore hard lesson anymore, I'll stop before that. It might be like a quarter of the way down to that hard lesson. I'm like, well, okay. And I do this like, let's just fast forward this and like see what this looks like if I stay in this position or doing what I'm doing for like a year or 2 years or 10 years, and being like, do I really want to learn that way? Can I be a little softer with myself? What does that look like if I make other choices? And then being able to do that, but still knowing that I'll make choices that aren't aligned with like old patterns of like learning hard ways, doing things that kind of pull on that past or previous version of me, and giving myself grace of like, yeah, it's okay. You know, you live and you learn. And sometimes we just end up in those spaces. So I'm hoping that I continue to move into a space of like soft learning and learning through joy and love and compassion. I think that, you know, you don't know how life will show up and like give you a course correction though, if you end up off your journey and what that looks like.
I think just thinking about what you were saying, I was thinking one of the things that we as humans, I always say the only thing that we leave behind when we die is the lessons we've learned and the love we leave behind. And so that's like the biggest gift, you know, is compassion. And one of the things on my book tour, as you know, it's such a white world. It's all like it's 90 to 100% older white women who attend my book events everywhere I go. And I can literally look out and see like, okay, there's one Indigenous person or there's 3 brown people. And, you know, they're always like, woohoo, like super loud. But one of the things that I found challenging on this book tour has been holding space for white people, because they often come up in tears and filled with guilt. And I really, really struggled with that at the beginning. And I found it so traumatizing to me because I just felt like an energy transfer. And then I was carrying stuff that didn't belong to me or imprinted on me. And when I was in Portland, I kind of turned a corner, because it wasn't through, and it was kind of through a bunch of bad experiences, but it wasn't through something super traumatic. It was just a lot of going through and trying to understand. And one of the last experience that I kind of had in Portland, a woman came up and she was kind of downloading all this stuff, older white woman, and something clicked in my brain. And I just thought, I'm all she has to talk about this with. I'm the only person in her sphere. And I learned to hold space for her, and I learned to be compassionate on a different level. So I think that's one of the ways that I grew through, maybe not super hard, traumatic lesson, but just holding space for people that we might not be used to holding space for, and being like extra compassionate. But what I wanted to ask you is, I think for me, like having so many family members of mine, past friends, my circle, my community is so incredibly important. And one of the people on this journey, this book journey of mine, one of the people, and definitely not a mother figure or grandmother figure at all. I don't even know if an auntie, but a sister. Well, for one is you, but also Tanya Talega. And she's just been such a role model for me, someone who is just always there. There's never jealousy. There's never feelings. There's always just, I love you unconditionally. And I'm always here for you no matter what. And she knows like, this is going to be hard. And I'm wondering if there's somebody like that for you right now on this journey, because we're kind of in the same place in terms of our book tours being over and now we're home. But is there somebody who's kind of helped you, you know, role modeling or been that source of power for you, you know, of any gender?
Probably my cousin that I grew up with, like my sister, essentially, like going on road trips, watching VHS movies in my grandma's bed when we were little. And then we don't talk super often. She's very busy, has like a grown girl job, and we do like the back and forth, like giving each other like pep talks when we need it. But we have been through so much and grown into these like amazing women that still will rely on each other to feel brave. And, you know, she's been that person ever since we were like little on a playground and someone said something and she's like ready to fight them, right? Or like walking down a dirt road and like something crazy happens and we're holding hands, or going into my grandma's basement and we're scared of like whatever's down there. So we're like, we'll go down together. And on this book tour, in between cities, I was like, had just finished Toronto and was going to an event in Waterloo, and I was crying, and I had like such a hard day. Like I just hit a wall and I was like so in my grief. And I called my cousin, and as soon as she answered, she was like, hi. And I wasn't even able to talk. And she's like, I was waiting for you to call. I was wondering if you were going to hit this part. And I was like, and so and she'll just let me cry and hold that space for me and help put me back together in ways that I'm very grateful for. So she's definitely been that rock for me. And I think we need that. We need those like people who will be our hype women or hype men or hype individuals that will, you know, allow us to do that work in the world. And, you know, there's so many people in community behind the scenes that allow people to be medicine in the world because they're getting medicine and love from these sources, right? That become our like source of protection or our rooting and our grounding and all of those things.
So I get this question all the time and I kind of hate it, but I'm going to ask you it. What's next? Because I know, and I don't know if you want to talk about this at all, but I think at one point you were like, I'm not doing memoir ever again. But what is the future? Are you doing a next book? What's the plan?
Yeah. So yeah, I don't want to do memoir. I'm like, I'm good. I'm going to move into fiction, which I'm really excited about. So looking at crafting and creating some stories. I already have some like characters mapped out and some timelines. So sitting with that. And I'm excited to kind of lose myself in this world and really work on character development and become familiar with these individuals and this new space of creativity. And for me, I know we talked about like, how is land involved in these things? And for me, it's like, I'm really relying on the water and the land to help me write this because it is a historical fiction, like rooted in my territory. So I'm like, lend me your memory. And I believe in that. I'm like, it's going to work. It's going to help. We've been having this conversation for a year now, like me and the land and the water being like, okay. And then like, we're going to write this in my dreams, right? Like, all right. So
let's do it. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I think, should we move to questions? I don't know if Jacob is on available, if we should move to questions.
Yes. You've got questions in the private chat? And
here we go. Yes. Okay. Awesome.
Okay.
So this question, I don't know who it's from, but your book is called Becoming a Matriarch. What does it mean to become a matriarch? I would be interested to hear both Helen and Angela's response. Leanne, sorry.
Yeah, I think we talked about the differences and how like it's different in different communities and depending on where you're from and the structures that exist. So for me, I know that even how someone holds that space is going to be different person to person. And I learned that just through, I guess, like work that I've been doing. And I remember looking at people and being like, wow, I wish I was like really fierce like that. Because I can hold spaces and set a line and like shut things down. But like I do it from such like a loving space where I'm very like, don't really like conflict. Like we'll be very chill, but I'll do it in the best way that I know how. And being like, that's okay that I am in the world this way, that I'm a little bit softer, and knowing that we hold it in different ways. And for me, knowing that in this process of becoming, that I'm allowing myself to find out who I still am and am becoming, and how I'll hold that space. And knowing that there will always be times and moments that I'll have to, like, if necessary, like step in for my community, for people, for land, for water, because that responsibility in terms of like being in relationship, that doesn't go anywhere either.
There's a question from Mina that says, Helen, is there a meaning to the pattern painted on your hand?
Yes, it's actually a tattoo. It's a hand poke tattoo, and it is a grizzly bear.
Okay. And there's a comment from Erica Davis who says, I think it's incredible that the strength and love that you describe and felt in your mama and grandma shines through you, and that you share this strength and love with the world. We are so blessed. Yes, I agree.
I love Miss Erica. We haven't met either. We're just social media buddy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have a horrible cold. A question from Mara. I wonder if you each would want to tell us about a First Nations woman whose life and or work you wish to give a shout out to celebrate. Oh, that's nice.
Okay, so if I'm thinking like academic based stuff, Kim Anderson, she hosted me in Toronto at the public library, and Kim Anderson is an Indigenous female academic who's done some amazing work. There was a book called A Recognition of Being that gave me the framework or foundation of understanding the violence that I had been through. And I remember saying, like, without Kim Anderson, there is no like me in terms of like my work, because I wouldn't have been able to reach that point of expansion, to understand, to heal, to have the language. And so I'm really grateful for her, and just cognizant that we're like here because of those who kind of came before and trail broke. What about you, Angela?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go back to Tanya Talega, and I think it's just because she's also been a journalist in mainstream media and knows how hard that has been. Connie Walker as well. Just someone who, you're kind of in an institution that's not so indigenized and not so decolonized and not even really on that trajectory. And for Tanya in particular, just understanding what it's like to be the only Indigenous woman in a room, and, you know, having to use your voice and not feeling like you belong, and still making it, right? And still, you know, and breaking out of that as well, breaking out of journalism where you're so confined to never sharing your opinion, especially as an Indigenous person. And just seeing Tanya Talega just, you know, thrive with her column in the Globe and Mail and with her book. I mean, I don't really read that much. And so when I was writing my book, one of the things, Wabigijik Rice, another person, not a woman, but a man, and a man that I actually consider, I don't say this about many men, like I think he's the second man I've said this about, but an actual warrior who's actually stood up for people when needed. And he always told me, like, if you want to write good, you have to read. And so I remember just like reading Tanya Talega's book every day, like, okay, how is this structured? How is this worded? How many pages is this? And because her book was just so phenomenal and in the same genre a bit as my book. So yeah, I would say Tanya Talega and Wabigijik Rice. There's so many, right? Alicia Elliott, Jane Simpson. I love you. Just so many, right? So there's another question from Sam. Where do you see Canada at this point in terms of reconciliation? What would help the process to deepen and evolve in the best ways?
This is such a big question to end up the night. I always feel like change really happens over like kitchen tables, in the home, in relationships. I know that there is work and pathways being created. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that I live in a territory where there is still flooding that's going to be happening, even though there was opposition and continues to be opposition. And, so what does reconciliation look like and feel like in the face of things like that? Doesn't feel so real. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always tell people like we're not ready for reconciliation. Look, we're not even at the truth part, right? Like we're at the baby steps of truth, and we're not making space for Indigenous voices. So how can, we're still kind of at conciliation, right? We're still kind of in a fight. And you look at like the federal government continues to fight Indigenous people in court over our lands. It's not like they're like, okay, let's give it all back. They're actually working actively to take more and to fight over the little that we have. What is it, like I think it's like 7% Indigenous people have, control or self-determination over our own lands. So when you look at that, how can we go from that to reconciliation? And I know everyone has different notions of reconciliation, but for me, it doesn't feel like we're ready to face the reality that there's racism today, there's oppression today, there's, full forces against us today from all institutions. So for me, it's questionable, like how can we get there? It seems like we're missing a bunch of steps kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
What wisdom would you wish to pass along to girls of future generations?
Today I did this workshop with women, older women, and we talked about finding joy in body. So body being a site of like celebration, body being a site of rest, body being a site of like gentleness. And so for me, I think it would be something along those lines to inhabit your body as best you can, like with joy, and, figure out how you want to celebrate your body or how to be in joy. What does that look like? What are some of the actions that you can take? Because I know at a young age, body was like pretty much the opposite of that. And so learning to come to this space now of like joy and awe and wonder has been pretty amazing.
Are there any more comments or questions? Yeah, I mean, we're pretty much at the end. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And it's so nice to be in conversation with you. We do voice memos all the time. But it's good to have a real face-to-face conversation. And yeah, I don't know, Jacob, if you wanted to pop back on to kind of close things off, but...
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. It was a very powerful and I would say healing conversation. So thank you. I was really honored that you both came out for this. And thank you everyone for coming out to listen and for your questions. Becoming a Matriarch, let me bring up the cover here. Becoming a Matriarch is available from Banyen.com. And you can learn more about Helen's work at reclaimthewarrior.com and about Angela's work at angelasterritt.com. So thank you again, and until next time.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.